Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joel Simon. I'm the founding director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism in New York City. And today we're going to be discussing the threat of state hostage-taking, why it's happening, why journalists have been caught up in it, and what journalists and news organizations can do to reduce the risk. I should note that I first became interested in this issue when I was the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. For reporters around the world, being kidnapped and taken hostage became an occupational hazard. Following the murder of journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff by ISIS militants in Syria in 2014, I wrote a book about hostage policy called We Want to Negotiate. My conclusion was that the no concessions policy, i.e., we do not negotiate with terrorists, was not really working for the US and the UK. And while there are arguments for and against negotiating, in most instances, the only way to secure the release of hostages is to negotiate. Since I wrote that book, the risk landscape has really changed. And today, it's states rather than non-state actors that are responsible for the majority of hostage-taking around the world. And this raises a whole host of practical and policy challenges, which is precisely what we're going to talk about today. And so let me introduce my panelists. First, Masha Gessen. Masha is my colleague at the Newmark School, where they are the first ever distinguished professor. They are a staff writer for The New Yorker and author of numerous articles, which I'm sure you've all read, and I'm sure you've all read Masha's wonderful books. One of my favorites is Surviving Autocracy, very relevant for today. And Masha, thank you so much for being with us. And
it's an honor.
Thank you, Masha. And I'm also joined by Jason Rezaian. Jason is a columnist for the Washington Post, and one of the world's leading authorities on hostage policy and response. And one unfortunate reason for that is that Jason acquired that expertise from his own personal experience. Jason was arrested under false pretenses in 2014 and became a state hostage in Iran. He was released after 544 days. That happens to be the subtitle of his book, which is called Prisoner, and the title of his podcast, which he produced with his wife Yegi, and which came out in 2021. And my advice is you should not start listening to it unless you have nothing else to do for the next 7 hours, because you will not be able to stop. So Jason, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Joel.
And I'm going to start with Masha. So Masha, my first question to you is for astute observers who might have been noticing the program here. You were not listed on the program until you arrived in Italy, and that was Wednesday. Can you tell us why?
So I am one of more than 200 people, most of us, I think, journalists, but I'm not sure, who have been charged by the Russian government with spreading false information about the Russian military. A small minority of that number are, and as of last count, it was 255 people. So a small minority are people in Russia who are actually in prison. A majority, and this is true of people who are on Russia's other lists, because it maintains a number of lists. A majority of people are outside the country, and many of them are journalists, civil society activists, human rights activists. And it's a really interesting, one might say, new instrument of that. I don't know if we classify it exactly as state hostage-taking, but it's certainly state persecution beyond borders, right? Where you're on notice and you have to watch your step all the time. And for example, I have been advised by people who are in a position to know, but it's all sort of on the level of general assessment. Europe is a dangerous place for Russian journalists. Several Russian journalists have been poisoned in Europe in the last 2 years. It's a concerted campaign of both assassination and intimidation, and so it is better not to let them know in advance that you're going to be in a European Union country.
So I don't recommend this, but just play this out. If you were to get on a plane tomorrow and go to Russia, what would happen to you?
Oh, if I were to get on a plane tomorrow and go to Russia, I would get arrested. Like that's because I've been arrested in absentia.
And what would be the process? What do you, like, how would it play out? I don't know if you want to kind of go there, but like I'm just so people kind of understand the legal risk that you're living with.
I can tell you exactly how it would play out because we've actually seen it play out live on air when Alexei Navalny flew to Moscow in January 2021. When he came to passport control, he was arrested. So that's what would happen to me. But the thing is, you know, I'm not about to fly to Russia because I know I've been arrested in absentia. A much more complicated calculus is, for me and hundreds of other people, is how we move around the world more generally. Like, for example, if I were to fly from, if I wanted to go to a country that's not Russia, from, let's say I want to go from New York to Georgia. Also ill-advised because many of these post-Soviet countries are increasingly cooperating with Russia. But a danger point for me would be landing in Istanbul. That's a place where I could get detained. There are countries that have signed extradition agreements with Russia, such as Thailand and Indonesia. These are new extradition agreements. I mean, I want to say these are hardly major hardships compared to actually being in prison or actually being, you know, under mortar fire from Russia. But it is, I think, notable as a persecution tactic that completely traverses national borders.
Right. So, for you, it's hypothetical. For Jason, it's real. You were arrested. You were a correspondent in Tehran in 2014. Did you have any sense that you were at risk at that time?
So I had been working on and off in Iran starting in 2002 until 2009 when I moved there full-time. I always worked with accreditation from the press ministry, which meant that I was very much on the state's radar. You can't operate as a journalist transparently you can't operate as a journalist without being transparent and without permission in that country if you're working for a major news outlet, international outlet with your byline. There were a lot of times in the years between 2009 and 2014 when I thought that I was at risk of being arrested for covering a protest or certain stories that I wrote. But to be honest, when I took the job as the Washington Post's correspondent in 2012, I thought that that was a protective layer. And when I was taken, it was when the nuclear negotiations between Iran and world powers were really starting to intensify and look as though that they would come to a deal. So it seems, on an intuitive level, that this is not the right time for a state to take an American hostage. But when you kind of play it out a bit, it makes a lot of sense, because I was taken as leverage as part of those negotiations. And we see that more and more with cases like others that we'll talk about right now.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to the motivation, but one of the things I just want to note in terms of the book and the podcast as well is, it's actually, you mined your experience in an Iranian prison for humor. That's a difficult thing to do. I want to commend you. But I wanted
people to read it. So.
I want to ask you, what insights did you glean through your interrogation about the motivation of the hostage takers? First from within the prison, and then we'll talk about how you came to understand it after you were released.
Yeah, so I think it took many weeks and maybe several months to really understand what was really going on. And I think, my wife and I were arrested together. We were separated, thrown in solitary confinement, subjected to long, brutal interrogations based on really frivolous information that they had accessed from our emails. They had conducting sort of a phishing operation on our emails and social media accounts a few days before our arrest. And so you have this idea that it's all just a big mistake that's going to get resolved. And none of these cases are a big mistake. They don't get resolved magically. Hostages are taken because a power wants to extract something from another power. But that didn't become clear to me for months as their treatment of me changed. When I had illnesses and they took care of me physically, I started to understand, okay, my health matters because a dead hostage is a worthless hostage.
Right.
So, you know, I think the motivations from the point of view of the people that I was dealing with on a daily basis, my prison guards and my interrogators, these are pretty low-level folks in the system. They've been trained to believe that anything that has to do with America is an enemy. So if their boss says you're a spy, then you're a spy. But as I kind of worked my way up and had more powerful people interrogating me, it was quite clear that this was a gambit to try and extract something.
And now you were released in 2016. It was part of a deal negotiated between Iran and the U.S. It involved an exchange of prisoners, a release of assets, $1.4 billion in assets that were seized, belonged to Iran, but were seized by the U.S. after the Islamic Revolution. So what do you understand today about the motivation of the Iranian government in basically arresting you and using you as a kind of diplomatic hostage?
Me and many people since,
right,
and previously.
Right.
You know, I think we have this tendency to want to punish regimes like Iran, like Russia, for specific activities. We do it through sanctions, oftentimes financial sanctions. And oftentimes it's a freezing of an asset, right? In the case of Iran, it's usually oil revenue that's being held in third countries. And, you know, increasingly I've started to think we need to stop doing this because they are not going to change their behavior to get that money back, but they're going to get that money back. And it's cheaper and easier to take a Westerner hostage and turn it into a public crisis, right, than changing their behavior overall. So I think we have to look at the approach, you know, the conventional, symmetrical, international ways of doing things don't work with these kinds of rogue states.
Well, let's kind of now transfer some of that same logic to try to understand the Russian government's behavior. They've arrested a series of Americans, Brittany Griner, the basketball star, Trevor Reed, who was another American, was arrested, exchanged, was an exchange with the U.S. They were both released. Currently, there are 3 Americans, at least, in prison who are state hostage. Evan Gershkovich, the journalist for the Wall Street Journal, Alsu Kurmasheva from Radio Free Liberty, and Paul Whelan, who's another American. Do you think, why is Russia doing this? Is it a strategy that's working for them? How should we understand this behavior?
Well, Russia is counting on this strategy working for them, and I think it's a very good question because you do have to enter sort of the Kremlin worldview to understand how this is working. By the way, I don't know that Alsu Kurmasheva is in that same category. There's another dual citizen who was she also has both a Russian and a U.S. passport. She was on a list of foreign agents, which is another list of enemies that Russia has, and went to Russia, I think, not thinking that she was going to get arrested, believing that she wasn't in violation of any criminal laws, and then was arrested. And then there's another dual citizen who was also arrested under similar circumstances, who is not a journalist. So I think that may actually be just targeted at that particular group of people, which is people who hold 2 passports and who move freely between the West and Russia, and it's signaling to us that no, you can no longer move freely between the West and Russia. Whereas Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan are definitely in that category. And Russia has made it very clear what it wants. It wants a convicted Russian assassin, a man named Krasikov, who is held by Germany. It's an interesting insight into the Kremlin worldview because, of course, they really do see the entire West as a monolith. And they think that the State Department tells Germany what to do. And at first, when Evan was arrested more than a year ago now, the State Department was really at a loss. They were like, well, but we don't even have anybody. And Russia was acting like they were playing dumb because, of course, they had somebody. They knew exactly who they had. They had this assassin in Berlin, right? So that's that's their concept of the world. What has now come out in the open since the death of Alexei Navalny was that there were negotiations that may have resulted in the release of Evan and several Russian political prisoners, including Alexei Navalny. And it seems that Russia was signaled that it's willing to kill him, to take him out of the negotiations when it was made clear that there was no alternative in terms of exchange. So that's created a whole new situation that I think is almost impossible for negotiators to resolve. Like, how do they negotiate for someone else without putting that person in danger?
Right. That's the sort of paradox of hostage taking, and then the whole playing out the no concessions challenge is is your priority to win the release of this individual person, or is your priority to disincentivize the behavior? And that's the enormous challenge, and one that you, Jason, have probably thought about more than anybody else. So when you look around the world, what other states are engaging in this kind of behavior?
So Iran, Russia, China, Myanmar from time to time, Syria, Venezuela. I think we've cleared the decks of Americans in Venezuela temporarily. Saudi Arabia.
That's
Turkey,
a lot of countries.
Lots of countries.
And are journalists especially vulnerable?
I think we're especially vulnerable because more of us travel to some of these places than ordinary citizens. And they think that the audacity of my arrest and Evan's arrest in particular are a signal, like Masha was saying, that not only are dual nationals not safe and might be targeted, but Western journalists as well. And I think it's changed the calculation of our newsroom leadership on where people should be going. We haven't had anybody reporting from Iran for a single day at the Post since the day I was arrested almost 10 years ago. And I don't think that there's any intention to send anybody back. We have people who go into Russia to get their visas extended, but then they leave and report from somewhere else. I don't know how long we'll be able to do that. China is another situation where we don't have people actively on the ground all the time. And I think, bad guys are winning in a lot of ways, right? Because the hostage taking is resulting in them unlocking the things that they want to receive. And it's also keeping us out of really essential flashpoint countries at a time when we need to know what's going on in those places.
And also I wanted you to both, Masha and Jason, you're both dual nationals. And you spoke a little bit about this, Masha, just the special risk that dual nationals face and the signal that Russia is trying to send in Alsu's case. But I wonder, is there special and particular risks that dual nationals face in this new global environment?
I think it's really not clear because, of course, there's sort of the letter of the law, which is that when you're a national of a country, strictly speaking, they will treat you as their own subject without regard for whatever other passport you may carry. In point of fact, that's not how it works, right? A high-profile American hostage is a high-profile American hostage, and the U.S. Embassy is never going to say, or the State Department is never going to say, oh, well, this person has a Russian passport, we're not going to go to bat for them. As always, as with all risks that journalists and other people face, the less known you are, the less high profile you are, the more you're at risk. So if we're dual national, even like somebody like Alsu, who was working for a US media outlet, but the media outlet doesn't have as big a megaphone in the United States as the Wall Street Journal, and she herself was not as well known as Evan. I'm sure that there are a lot more people in this room who have heard of Evan Gershkovich's case than of Alsu's case, right? And so I think that's actually how I would measure the risk factor.
Yeah. And Jason, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mostly agree. I think also this idea that we're subject to the laws of those countries. Anybody that enters a foreign territory is subject to the laws of wherever they are. And actually, going back to my case and some in the years immediately after, State Department did do a lot of mental gymnastics around, well, it's, this person's a dual national, it's much more complicated. It's not complicated. You're the United States government, and you have a responsibility to the people who are your citizens. Yeah. We believe in a system of law that's based on the presumption of innocence. We're being denied that when we are taken by these foreign states. We should mobilize all the powers available to us to free those people. Now, then it gets complicated, right? Because what extents are we willing to go to? But I don't think defining the problem is the complicated thing.
And so as journalists and news organizations, do you think there are practical steps that we can take other than simply avoiding countries where we may be at risk? Are there strategies and advice and guidance that we can offer that might reduce the risk in certain circumstances? And one, I also want you to address, we've been talking about American journalists. Is this a phenomenon that is uniquely a unique risk factor for U.S. journalists, or are there other journalists from other countries who are also facing similar risk?
I think anybody who's working for a big news organization, wherever that country is, and if they have a track record of negotiating and really, applying value to their citizens, the value of their own citizenship, those people are at risk. Things that we can do, two things, very different things. One, how we tell these stories. On the day that Evan was arrested, or when that news broke, there were so many stories that said Wall Street Journal correspondent arrested and charged with espionage in Russia. That's not the story.
Right.
Right? And, I've had this conversation with, hard news reporters and editors. Well, these are the facts. No, that's not a fact. You are acting as a stenographer for the Kremlin if you just say that, he was arrested and charged with espionage. There's so much more context there that people don't understand. And actually, with my own editors at the Post, I brought this up, and they said, well, nobody thinks he's a spy. I said, you don't know that. Nobody in Washington thinks he's a spy. Nobody in New York thinks he's a spy. Nobody in San Francisco thinks he's a spy. And I remember sitting down in a Uber, and the driver was listening to talk radio, and that headline was all that people heard, right? U.S. journalist taken, arrested, and accused of espionage. So we have to redefine how we tell these stories. The other thing that I think we need to do, there's a chilling effect that happens to journalists in countries where this happens, not just to foreign journalists, but local ones as well. And people are being exiled, arriving in countries in Europe, in the US, Canada, and UK. And I think we need to figure out how to take these people that have incredibly pertinent and relevant recent experience and get them into our news organizations to help us understand these countries better.
Yeah, go ahead, Masha.
I want to pick up right on that because I think there are two things that are going on. One is obviously the hostage taking of individual people, but it goes hand in hand with how these countries are also trying to control coverage, right? This is part of their relationship with foreign media, and we're seeing that really clearly with Russia, that they're doing something absolutely unprecedented. They didn't, Jason was describing, thinking this is a mistake, it's going to be cleared up. I'm sure that's what Evan was thinking, because nothing like this has happened, like ever, not even during the entire Soviet totalitarian period. There was one US journalist who was arrested in the mid-1980s, accused of espionage, and he was released within a week. This was Nicholas Danilov, who was the bureau chief for the US News and World Report. So arresting a Western journalist is an extreme act, and it's an extreme act of control over coverage. And at the same time, the Kremlin still wants coverage. They still extend people's visas, they still invite people for press tours, they still, Putin gave an interview to Tucker Carlson, and we may not be able to engage at Tucker Carlson in this conversation, but certainly we should engage all the US media in this conversation, and I would say make it clear that they're not going to get any coverage of any sort, no media tours, no people accepting their accreditation. As pricey as that is for a news organization, I think the price of having Russia control coverage is higher.
Agreed. That's really interesting. And what should be the posture? So the thing about hostage taking or diplomatic hostage taking is it also puts journalists in an uncomfortable, and news organizations in an uncomfortable position vis-a-vis their own governments, because only the US government can resolve these issues. And Jason, in your case, in the case of Evan Gershkovich, we don't know how exactly what Alsu's status is, but that's also possible that there'll be a negotiated resolution. In her case, Paul Whelan, it's not a journalist, but it's part of the same kind of situation here. So what should the posture of news organizations and journalists be when they are absolutely dependent on a government with whom they have to maintain some sort of critical distance to resolve these situations on their behalf? How do you address that?
Maybe I'm stupid, but
I don't think so.
I just don't think this is very complicated. I think that it's the government's job to stand up for its citizens, and the strongest position that a media outlet can take is, we're going to hold you accountable for doing your job of keeping your citizens safe. Entering into some kind of agreement with government negotiators about keeping it under wraps, not reporting negotiations. I mean, I think that some of that may be necessary, but it has to be seen as an absolutely necessary evil, and it has to be minimized, rather than, I think, the posture that's often taken, which is we're working as a team on these negotiations, right. Which I think is dangerous.
Right.
So, I'm all for maintaining the adversarial relationship between the press and the government, but I think on these particular cases, there are certain sorts of understandings that have had to come together on my case, on Evan's case, and others, and I think that's appropriate. I think that's okay. I know that in the final couple of days before I was released, there was about half a dozen news organizations that, in coordination with the State Department, sat on that news.
Right.
Somebody from the State Department who, and this is true, who was sort of pissed off about the direction of these nuclear negotiations and didn't think it should happen, told something to a reporter from a major news organization at a bar at a happy hour, like 3 days before I got out. If that news had broken, I don't know that I would have gotten out. So there is a sort of symbiosis that has to exist sometimes, and we talk a lot about it in what they call the hostage recovery community, not just with journalists in the state, but NGOs and others who work in this space. At times, it's a very adversarial relationship with the government, but ultimately, everybody has the same goal of bringing this fellow citizen home. And that's the thing that I think needs to be prioritized.
Well, that's a perfect transition to the next series of questions I want to ask you, Jason. So you've been directly involved in hostage policy discussions, thinking about reform. That's something you've been focused on since your release from prison, and you've seen this transition in the kind of risk landscape and the focus on state hostage-taking, and you are currently the co-chair of a commission on hostage-taking and wrongful detention, which is run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. You invited me to serve on this commission, and I agreed to do so, so we're both involved in this exercise. So can you talk a little bit about the work that the Commission is doing, what you see as the most promising potential strategies, the kinds of reforms that are necessary to actually advance hostage recovery in this new climate?
As you know, Joel, our meetings go on long and we have them often, so I won't get into all of it. But you know, I had this idea that we need to be talking about this in a more integrated way with people that are in and out of government, law enforcement, diplomats, lawmakers, journalists, former hostages, family members of hostages. So we put together a really incredible group of, I think, 18, 19 of us. And the intention is that we'll make recommendations on policy shifts to whoever is inaugurated in January of next year. You've been watching this space closely for the last 10 years. There have been several inflection points, moments where policy has shifted, and I think we're at a point now where everybody is starting to speak the same language about this, starting to recognize the problem. So a key function of what we're doing, I think, is sort of defining the differentiation between what a terrorist hostage-taking versus a state hostage-taking is. What are the motivations of different actors? You know, we talk about this as a play for leverage in negotiations between two countries, but the reason that Russia does it compared to Iran is quite different. Russia is trying to get human assets, right? Spies, murderers, people who are close to Putin. Iran wants money. I'm not 100% sure what China wants when they do this, and sometimes I think they want different things. And I think really, you know, building a language to talk about these issues and figure out how to make it costlier moving forward. Because something that you talked about up top was, you know, the concern of, does negotiating settlements incentivize the hostage-taking? Now, you know, there's one guy in the space who's been doing this for a long time, since the Nixon era, Brian Michael Jenkins. Yes. And he's been studying this for 50 plus years, and his research says that there's no, you know, visible direct correlation. And I would say that it's the wrong sort of framework to look at this. We have to do whatever we can, whatever is necessary to bring people home. At the same time, and in parallel, have to figure out ways to make it less attractive, because the incentive is already there. There's nothing standing in these governments' way. As long as Americans are showing up in their territory, they can do this, because the tools, the legal tools that are available to us aren't being deployed properly. And so these are all of the things that we talk about on a regular basis, and hopefully someone listens.
Are there any specific ideas that you're excited about that you want to mention?
So we were talking about dual citizenship. You know, I am really eager to see if we can pursue strategies to make it less attractive for dual nationals to go home to their countries. We know that in Iran, for example, there are at least 10,000 US nationals, dual nationals, who live in Iran. That's a huge pool of potential targets, right? And those people often think to themselves, well, I'm not going to be targeted. I didn't do anything wrong. Jason must have done something wrong. I mean, this is the common narrative. So, you know, travel taxes for certain countries, the State Department has made what they call a D designation for countries that take hostages. Why not, you know, add a tax to the flights that go into those countries, as one example. And I think a grading system, right? Like the Commission on Human Trafficking, right? The US set this up, and every year countries are graded on where they stand on this, and you can go up and you can go down, and there are incentives to improve your behavior. I'd like to see something on this issue as well.
So, Masha, can you react to some of these ideas vis-a-vis Russia? Would any of these ideas create some negative disincentive for Russia? And if not, are there strategies that might achieve that you can think of?
I don't know. I think this is the time in the panel when I remind you that I'm a journalist. I can only talk to you about problems. I can't talk to you about solutions. So I don't know what would work. I do know that the one thing that doesn't work is sanctions.
Yeah.
I think Russia is a sterling example of how sanctions don't work. It's not just that they don't work, right? And I can explain why they don't work. But it's that they create the illusion of action. They take up time and resources. There's a huge mechanism at this point in the State Department, in the Department of the Treasury, devoted to creating and maintaining sanctions that don't work. Right. So we need to retire that and deploy all of those resources on devising something that will work.
Well, go ahead.
I mean, the only thing that I would say is that I think sanctions directed at individuals and using the Magnitsky Act more effectively, more often, isn't necessarily the final answer, but it's something that hasn't really even been explored. These are tools that have been created that should be used much more often.
Do you agree, Masha?
I disagree.
Disagree, why?
I mean, at the time, so just to bring people up to date, the Magnitsky Act was a really ingenious piece of legislation passed in the United States and later in the European Union following the 2009 death in a Russian prison of an accountant who had uncovered a corruption scheme and went to the authorities with it. The authorities were the corruption scheme, so they imprisoned him and killed him. And his employer, a British-American entrepreneur named William Browder, basically became this one-man campaign to avenge the death of Sergei Magnitsky and passed the Magnitsky Act, which created a set of sanctions for Russian citizens who are found guilty not by a court but by the Department of the Treasury of gross human rights violations. And I think for about a minute it was an effective tool because these Russians were people who had assets abroad, who had children abroad, and who thought of themselves as citizens of the world. But 10 years later, more than 10 years later, Russia is a self-isolating and isolated power that's waging a genocidal war of aggression that actually has based an entire sort of propaganda machine on this idea that it is under siege by these Western sanctions. And when Russia kills Navalny and the United States sanctions the head of the prison or somebody, where Navalny was killed, that's just ridiculous, right? Like somebody actually spent their valuable work time and was paid by the taxpayers to sanction somebody in the Arctic Circle who was never going to be able to leave Russia, also because Russia doesn't allow its law enforcement to cross borders. Like, that's just ridiculous.
And I think, we really need to take this back to the Commission as part of our discussions, but I think what it says to me is, and this is true of hostage policy in general, is the policy is made in response to the last crisis. And then you have a new crisis, and the policy you're working with is the one that was created in response to the last one. So, the Magnitsky Act may have been a valuable tool when conditions were different. It's not relevant today. So I think this is something, Jason, we should talk about.
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, I think it might be appropriate to some countries. Right? Something similar.
Yeah, countries that are not as isolated.
Exactly. And I think part of what we have to do is really differentiate between, as I was saying earlier, what's the motivation? And I think that the disincentive is sort of a mirror image of the motivation, right? So rather than, blocking pots of money from Iran to say, hey, if you do this, we're going to give you your money back, you have to think of another way of making it painful for them, because they will find a way to get that money back if you tell them that that money is available if they change their behavior. Because the answer is, okay, you say that money is ours and you're going to give us our money. You say that you're going to give it to us if we do X. What if we do Y? And they've been proven over and over again that doing Y will get them their money.
Okay, I want to go to just a couple more, one question more for each of you, and then we'll open it up to the audience, so please have your questions ready. So, Masha, I just want to go back to something you said, which was, since Nicholas Davidoff in the Danilov, right? Danilov, was the last Western journalist who was briefly detained and accused of espionage, and now it's a whole new reality where, we have Gershkovich, we have Kurmasheva. Why? What has changed that makes something, and I think this perhaps also applies to Jason's situation in Iran and others, that made, journalists were sort of treated as international correspondents, as like quasi-diplomats. Something changed in their status. What happened?
I don't know. I don't know what happened, but I think it's important to understand that something has changed, right? And apparently it changed. I mean, I only really started paying attention when it was changing in Russia. But Jason, you told me the other day that the day you were arrested was the day you picked up your renewed journalist accreditation. Right. So we used to think, and this was, more than 10 years ago, right? Which is something I didn't realize, but we used to think of accreditation, journalist visas, negotiations as a kind of direct negotiation with the government. Right. Possibly what's happened in Russia, and I think this is similar to Iran, is that the government did used to be much more of a monolith. And now it is actually a set of competing mafia organizations in Russia that are competing for favor with Putin. So if Putin signals that something or someone or a country is an enemy, then they are trying to devise ways to curry favor with Putin by attacking enemies in new ways. So we can't predict exactly how they're going to do it, but we can predict that they're going to continue escalating.
Okay, so before we go to questions, I just have one last thing I want to ask you, Jason, which is, as someone who's spent 544 days in prison in Iran in a very isolated situation, what can people do if they want to support Evan Gershkovich or also Kurmasheva, or does the kind of public awareness, is it meaningful from your perspective?
From the perspective of a hostage, it's incredibly meaningful. One, when you hear, and I know that Evan is able to receive letters, when you hear that you haven't been forgotten about, it is a very uplifting thing. But it also, is pretty clear that when these cases become so high profile, that's the thing that forces the US government, other Western governments into action. So, ultimately, although Putin is responsible, right, and he is the perpetrator here, it's the US president who is the one who is going to unlock that situation. And that often doesn't happen until it becomes politically too costly not to do something. Right. So I'm always on the side of bringing the hostage home, and so I won't shut up about it. But I think, say people's names and repeat them as much as possible in any situation, especially with government officials.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Okay, questions? We have just a couple minutes. Are there questions from the audience? I think we have one right here.
Ginko Kobayashi, Japanese journalist from London. Could you, I'm sorry, I forgot your last name, but Jason, I'm sorry to call you by first name, but can you make a comment about the James Foley case, about the American government's response to him? Because I read his mother's book, and she's quite dissatisfied by the American government's response, which is that the American government, its policy is not to pay the ransom to hostage takers, and also families were really kept away from all the negotiations or support. Thank you.
I think I would highly recommend Joel's book, We Want to Negotiate, which I think was largely inspired by Diane Foley and her fight for answers and accountability in the murder of her son. And I think all of us who've come after Jim have benefited from the incredible work that she continues to do. I mean, this is her life work. I don't think we'd be having these conversations if it wasn't for Diane Foley. And I think that her struggle, and very persistent, principled struggle for justice and answers, and also accountability within the US government, has changed the equation dramatically and led to all the shifts in policy. And this combative relationship between the government and families has really stopped. And I think that's because of Diane.
Yeah. Diane, if you're watching, we're cheering for you. Thank you, Diane. I think there's a question here, then one in the back. Let's go with this one, and the one in the back there.
Thank you for this fascinating panel. My name is Ada Petrychko. I'm a journalist from Poland. I have a question for Masha. You mentioned that just before Alexei Navalny was killed, it's something that it's been disclosed recently that there were negotiations and they were pretty advanced, and we don't know whether to believe it or not, but Putin said that he actually agreed to Navalny being freed, which I have no idea, but there's a weird paradox here in which why would he allow for such negotiations to even take place and then kill Navalny? Do you have any insight on that?
We don't know that he agreed, right? I mean, it's not a question of whether to believe it or not. It's that we obviously don't have that from Putin directly. We have it from people who represent themselves as negotiating on the part of the Kremlin. And the problem with that entire sort of mafia power structure is that it is constantly a whole bunch of sort of freelancers jockeying for positions, jockeying for power. There are people who claim to be negotiating who don't even have access to decision makers. That's part of the problem with these negotiations, and especially when they're being carried out by third parties, which in this situation is almost inevitable because parties can't talk directly, but also because basically the State Department has to negotiate for somebody who's held by Germany. So a third party is inevitable. So there's at least one person who was representing himself as a negotiator who said that the exchange was approved. That's all we can say, right?
Okay, thank you. I think the next question's in the back. Okay, well, there's one here. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Svenja Schlicht. Hi, my name is Svenja Schlicht. I'm a journalist for the German public television. I think it was you, Masha, you talked about how Russia relies a lot on the publicity from international journalists reporting on them and keeping their word out. So shutting that down can be quite helpful and denying them some power, but at the same time it's our job as journalists to look where regimes like that commit crimes. So how can we walk that tightrope? So withdrawing.
I'm really having a hard time understanding.
I'm sorry.
Let's try again.
How can we walk the tightrope between denying regimes like Russia the publicity that they get from us reporting on them, while still talking about the crimes they commit, especially towards their own people? Like Iran always comes to mind. How can we manage both of these things at the same time?
Okay.
I can answer regarding Russia. Russia has a pretty transparent media strategy, right? They want their position heard. They want Putin to be talking to people, or Putin's propaganda representatives, to be talking to people who are not well informed and who will not put up much of a resistance. It's not quantum science to deny them that opportunity and to say, no, we're actually going to be using people who are stationed outside of Russia, but who are actual experts and who have actual contacts with non-propaganda people inside Russia to do our reporting, and we're not sending anyone on your junkets.
Iran is the same, and I think, at this point, over the last 2 years since the big protests in Iran, in 2022. Over 100 journalists have been forced to flee the country. Most of them are living in pretty destitute situations. More and more of them are being welcomed to the United States. I'm aware of many of them, and I know their struggles trying to get up and running. And all of them almost want to get back into journalism. And I think as major news organizations, we have to help figure that piece of the equation out. And the truth is, it's a tidal wave of journalists like that from Russia, from Iran, from China, from several other countries that, news organizations are not equipped to think about 5 years from now. But we won't be in those places 5 years from now if these challenges against us persist. So we should be thinking about that, and what Masha just said is I agree with completely.
Well, that's a very inspiring note to end on. I mean, this has been a difficult conversation, but I want to thank Masha, I want to thank you, Jason, for joining us, for sharing your perspective, Jason, for all the amazing work that you're doing to defend and advocate for the safe return of hostages around the world. So thanks to both of you. Thanks to our audience.
Thank you both.
We appreciate it very much.